You know, one of the great things about these events is the opportunity to network and talk to people, and I always feel very guilty asking everyone to be quiet so we can start the event, but I very much appreciate your coming today. It's a wonderful opportunity for us to have a good conversation about a very important relationship. I did want to thank our partners, the National Cherry Blossom Festival, for once again, for the fourth year in a row, for partnering with Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA. The Cherry Blossom Festival is a wonderful annual celebration of spring, of the gift of cherry blossoms from Japan to Washington, and it's also a celebration of the enduring relationship between the United States and Japan. So at Sasakawa Peace Foundation, we're delighted to sponsor an event related to the festival. I also wanted to welcome some participants we have today from the Embassy of Japan. Minister Kuroda is, I believe, here somewhere, I hope, and we very much appreciate that. And we also have some guests from the Embassy of India. And finally, I wanted to mention one special thing. We have students from American University's Washington Semester Program. Could you raise your hand, those AU students, so people can see who they are? Yeah, let's give them a round of applause. This is a wonderful program to provide students who are outside of the Washington, D.C. area the chance to come to Washington and spend a semester here and learn about the U.S. government. These are both American and foreign students. So those of you who are sitting at tables with AU students, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, because one of the reasons they're coming to Washington is to get to know this city, and so I hope this is a good opportunity for them to network with some of you as well. The purpose of today's event is certainly the mission that Sasakawa USA has, which is to strengthen U.S.-Japan relations. Our objective in participating in the National Cherry Blossom Festival this year is to promote policy discussions on U.S.-Japan relations and key issues in the Asia-Pacific. This program is a part of our series called Views of Japan. And the reason we do this is because many Americans when they think about Japan, they think about our bilateral relationship, which is very, very important. But Japan is a global power with global interests, and what that means is the United States and Japan often find ourselves working together to promote shared values and shared interests. So we decided to sponsor a series of programs called Views of Japan to introduce to American audiences how other countries are looking at Japan and some of the common themes that we have. So a year ago, we had an African Views of Japan seminar, and we've also had a Southeast Asian Views of Japan and European Views of Japan. So we're very delighted today to have this event focusing on India and the India-Japan-U.S. trilateral relationship. I don't think many people will ask why India, but let me just tell you anyway the answer to that question. You know, India, like Japan and like the United States, is a democracy. We very much have a lot of common interests, and I've been struck as an American by the rapid development of a very close relationship between Japan and India. As you probably know, Japan and India has a foreign minister level strategic dialogue, which just occurred recently. And at the end of that dialogue, Foreign Minister Kono said, India is Japan's most important partner in its free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. And soon there'll be a high-level meeting between Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Abe. So it's a really interesting relationship from the American point of view, and we're interested in hearing more about that. And the last thing I'll mention as a note for our audience, when you came in, if you did not pick up, please do so. We have some publications at the front table. Japan Matters for the United States and India Matters for the United States. They're wonderful publications that have a lot of data, particularly on the economic relationship, but also on our people-to-people and strategic ties as well. These publications are done by the East-West Center. I think Satu Lamea is here somewhere from the East-West Center, thank you. But they really are wonderful publications, and I encourage you, those of you who are interested in U.S.-Japan and U.S.-India relations, to pick up a copy of those publications. So today we're going to start with an overview of Japan's cultural influences in India, which is in keeping with our theme of art, music, and play. And the speaker we're going to be asking to speak is Yoshiaki Koga, who's the editor and India project director of Kodansha. For those, I think many of you know of Kodansha, one of the largest Japanese publishing houses. They publish a lot of books in Japanese, but they also have a very large translation division, and many of the Japanese novels in translation that you may have read have actually been translated and then published by Kodansha, including Murakami Haruki, one of my favorite Japanese authors. But Koga-san is working on Kodansha's efforts in India, and so we're going to ask him to talk a little bit about his work there. And then after that, I'll introduce our panel, and our panel will be discussing India's views of Japan. So let me turn things over to our director of our education program, who's responsible for this event, Kazuo Kato, to proceed. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the special feature of our program today. This portion of the program has been scheduled to explore Japan's cultural influences in India and the impact of those influences. Our plan is to have a fun conversation because we're prepping for a serious policy discussion later on. And our featured speaker, as Ambassador Zumo introduced, is Mr. Yoshiaki Koga, who has really developed many unique projects in India as in his current capacity as editor and India project director. Mr. Koga has been with the publisher since 1989, and but prior to this current position, he also worked with France to found and serve as the first editor-in-chief of Courrier Japan, which is an international news magazine. But for those who are interested to learn more about Mr. Koga, you have his bio in your handouts. So in the next 30 minutes, we will introduce Mr. Koga's animation and children's illustration book projects in India. And our goal really is to inspire the audience to think about the role that cultural exchanges can play to improve understanding between the people of two countries, and also shed some light on the similarities between Japan and India that make those exchanges impactful. My name is Kazuo from Sasakawa USA, and I have the pleasure of facilitating this conversation. Mr. Koga, thank you again for traveling from Japan to join us. We're delighted to have you here. So to begin, our first question, Mr. Koga, how did you first become involved in India?
So I'm Yoshiaki Koga. Nice to meet you. Is it okay?
Yes.
So first of all, thank you for having me at this forum. And also, I would like to thank Sasakawa Foundation having me to talk about our project in India. So when I was in college in 1986, I had a trip to India for 3 months, from east to west, Kolkata, and Varanasi, Delhi, Jaipur, Jaisalmer, and Ladakh, also Kashmir. And I was impressed by Indian culture. And I was surprised to know about Indian people. First of all, Indian people are flexible to accept differences of culture and language, also religion. And also, Indian people are very energetic, as you know, and they have a great vitality. Then, so my first trip to India became an opportunity to think about that I will come back again, India, and also learn more about India. Years later, I start to think about how I can get involved business about India. Then I'm here now.
Well, you're in the right place then. From the Japanese perspective, and particularly as a Japanese businessman and publisher, what makes India an attractive place to work and a partner to work with?
So, well, I can think of 4 important factors from Japanese perspective. First of all, potential of book market, because now, so rising middle class offers a great market for every business, including publishing business. Now, do you know, Kato-san, where is the biggest book market of the world?
I have no idea. I don't know. India?
Of course, U.S.
US.
First is U.S. and next and China, and fourth Japan, and sixth place of world it's India. But since 2011, market of books in India has been increasing by 20% every year. So India has a huge market, a huge potential of publishing business. Yes. And the second one is demographics. Because 50% of its 1.3 billion population under the age of 25 years, India has a great demographic dividend. And third one is the largest democracy. Because China also is a great market, but the regulation of government is very stiff. And also, this is an important aspect for publishing company. And the last one, Japan and India relationship, because the geopolitical and business relationship between India and Japan is very strong. And also, business environment is improving day by day. That's it.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Looking from the other side, from the India's perspective, what do you think makes Japan an attractive partner to work with?
I think that is creative contents, such as manga, as you know, a Japanese comic, and also animation. In last decade, many Japanese animation have been telecasted in India, but only caters to the age group below 10 years old. But now these days, next generation between 10 to 20 years old are keen to access Japanese content. So recently, a friend of mine who is a journalist at a leading Indian newspaper, he shared his views by comparing with American content, Japanese content with American and Indian. And he said that, so the story of animation and comics Japanese, it's like they are more mature and complex. Also, they are, he said that they are multidimensional. But while American and Indian are one-dimensional. So, but Japanese manga were influenced by Hollywood before. So now, but Hollywood has seen the reverse influence of Japanese content. Have you seen the movie Ghost in the Shell? The Ghost in the Shell is the story, the original story of Ghost in the Shell. It's a Japanese manga. So Kodansha published this manga. So now I think we expect that Japanese content become more popular in India, I think.
Well, you seized on that opportunity and actually pioneered the first joint animation project between India and Japan called Suraj, the Rising Star. And for our audience, this is the televised animation, which is a remake of a famous Japanese sports anime in the 1970s about a boy training under a very strict father to become a very successful baseball player for the Yomiuri Giants. It's called Kyojin no Hoshi for our Japanese audience. you not only reproduced this anime in Hindi language, but also changed the sport from baseball to cricket, India's national sport, as all of you know. Why did you think about doing this project, and what were the goals that you were trying to achieve?
At first, I wanted to make an animation which gave dream and hope to Indian children. So, because Indian economy now is growing up, but on the other hand, so there are many underprivileged children. So that's why. But I thought, what kind of story really attracts Indian children? Then I went to slum in Mumbai. I saw the children playing cricket. So they have gloves and bats. It reminded to me that playing baseball in my childhood. So, Kato-san, do you know the ABC of Indian favorite? Do you know?
I know
ABC.
C is cricket.
Yeah, C is cricket. So A is astrology, and B is Bollywood. Bollywood means Bombay Hollywood, means Indian cinema. C is cricket. So, as you know, cricket is like a religion for Indian people. So, it occurred to me, I will localize Japanese famous story of Kyojin no Hoshi by replacing baseball for cricket. But yeah, so I think that this story is really line with Indian thinking about that, I think. But everybody in Tokyo, in Japan, everybody objected to my idea. Because anyone has never done this kind of project. It was first time we remade a story for Japanese story for Indian. And also it is the first Indo-Japan collaborative project. But finally, I could persuade to produce this animation. But so.
Would you like? And I think we have a clip that we can show to.
Yeah. So, but I just told to I just explain. So, I also faces a lot of differences because between cultural differences. If I may, episode. So, in Kyojin no Hoshi, there is a very famous scene. So, where the father of the hero get angry very much, and he overturned the dining table with food. But this thing was not acceptable in India. What do you not think? Because it is because of the philosophy, respect for food in India. But it's a very famous thing. So we discussed many times with Indian staffs. Then finally, we could agree to overturn the table. Because with only glasses of drinking water left on the table.
No food.
So please have a look.
Yes,
Yeah.
could we play the clip, please?
जोशीले इरादों को उमड़ कर निकले मैदान में मुट्ठी में खौफ को जकड़ कर चले सीना तान के हौसला उसका सबसे बुलंद है जाने ये दुनिया वही सूरज है उभरता सितारा जो ना रुके हौसला उसका सबसे बुलंद है जाने ये दुनिया वही सूरज है उभरता सितारा जो वही सूरज है आंधियों को मोड़ के तूफानों को वो चीर के बाजी वो जीते हर कोई रुके ना रुके हौसला उसका सबसे बुलंद है जाने ये दुनिया वही सूरज है उभरता सितारा जो वही सूरज है
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Koga-san, I heard that Suraj received a lot of attention in India and viewership.
Yeah.
Why do you think it was popular among the Indian people?
Yeah, I think the key for success was the story, the theme of family and friendship and effort and guts. So it was like a movie, Indian movie, but it was a new type of animation in India. That's why I think. And we enjoyed 3 times the viewership of popular animation Doraemon.
Doraemon.
Yeah.
Okay, that's impressive. I'd like to now shift to another example of Mr. Koga's work. You have also been working on a children's illustration book called Mottainai Basang. For our audience, Mottainai is a Japanese word for it's wasteful or what a waste, and it expresses dismay at wasteful actions. Basan means grandmother, so Mottainai Basan is a story about a grandmother who keeps pointing out to her grandson that he's being very wasteful. And I think you have a copy of this, but this is what the book looks like. Mr. Koga, I heard you're working with the Japan International Cooperation Agency, JICA, to address a challenge in India through this book. Could you tell us more about this project?
So in the growing economy of India, but there are some serious environmental issues, such as garbage dumping and also environment pollution. And that, so but though Indian government is running a national level campaign, Clean India campaign. It's called Swachh Bharat. But it's difficult to change the awareness for people. Given these circumstances, I thought that maybe so the awareness can be educated by book. The name of books is Mottainai Grammar. So Mottainai means encompasses 4 R's. Reduce, reuse, and recycle, and most importantly is respect. So it teaches the importance of river and forest, also other natural resources. So now one of the Mottainai series picture books was launched in India January now. So I think we are hoping that Indian children will change mindset by Japanese books, I think.
And I'm curious what the reaction among the Indian children have been on this book, and I think we have a clip to maybe introduce that reaction.
Yes, yes. So
may we show that right now?
Yes.
Could you please play the second clip, please?
Mottainai for Swachh Bharat. As part of this JICA Kodansha project in India, the wonderful caravan has come all the way to India. Book reading habit can be easily inculcated with reading of picture books. Also, it is easy to imbibe social values through storytelling of picture books.
Good morning!
Caravan staff members along with storytellers visited schools in Delhi. Mottainai series of picture books were read out to children to create interest in reading habit and awareness about environmental cleanliness and hygiene. Here are some footages of the storytelling sessions activities conducted in government and private schools of Delhi.
अब ये दादी माँ, इसका नाम है मुक्ताई नाई दादी माँ। कौन सी दादी माँ? दादी माँ। अब इनका नाम मुक्ताई नाई क्यों पड़ गया? वो थोड़ा देखेंगे कहानी में, ठीक है? बहुत बढ़िया कहानी है, हाँ? ध्यान से देखना, ठीक है? ये बेचारा रो पड़ा, क्योंकि दादी माँ ने उसको कितनी बार कहा मोत्ताई नाई, मोत्ताई नाई, मोत्ताई नाई, हाँ? हमें कोई बार बार टोकते रहे तो फिर रोना भी आ जाता है ना, आ जाता है कि नहीं, हाँ? कैसे रोते हैं? कैसे रोते हैं छोटे बच्चे? करके रोते हैं ना?
हाँ, तो इतने में कोई दो आदमी था, वो उनके पास में आया और उसका नाम है मटमट भाई।
टॉयलेट में जाकर देखते हैं पॉटी हुई क्या, क्योंकि जो इंसान है वो तो सही जगह पे जाके बैठेगा, है ना? वो पेड़ पे चढ़ के नहीं करेगा, ना वो पानी में डूब के करेगा, ना वो ऐसे ही घूमते घूमते रास्ते में कहीं भी करता जाए और चलता जाए, ऐसा भी नहीं होगा, है ना? हमने कई बार देखा है गाय बैल घोड़े चल भी रहे हैं और पॉटी भी कर रहे हैं, हाँ? देखा है ना ऐसा? दिल्ली की सड़कों में भी हम देखते हैं, हाँ? ऐसे पड़े होते हैं सब रास्ते में।
Meaning is we should not waste anything. I don't want the birds to dirty the environment.
So you want a, what have you made?
Dustbin.
Okay.
One paper at wasted, I will make it any good thing and or I will see a waste thing, I will throw it in dustbin.
Small drawing activity was also organized for kids.
Like this, yeah.
Thank you. I think you helped the audience learn a new Japanese word, mottainai. That's great. So we talked about how successful you've been, but I'm sure there were challenges
Yes.
working with India. You mentioned a little bit about that earlier, but what do you think are the challenges that Japan and India need to overcome going forward?
I think what is needed from Japan's side, first one is flexibility. So in India, flexibility is expected. The baseball needed to become cricket. But the Japanese, many businesses come with set and preconceived notions, do not adapt, do not flexibly to adapt situations. I'll tell you another example. On refrigerator in India, a lock and key is essential. But Japanese companies couldn't grasp that due to a lack of flexibility. So Japanese companies may lost many sales, I think. And also, next one is speed, because India, as a growing country, so India is trying to catch up on things very fast. But a Japanese company often take a time to decide things, and so very late. And also, a lot of opportunities are lost to Korean and or Chinese companies, I think.
I see. Time flies, and we have about 5 minutes left. So I'd like to mention your projects in the United States, because Sasakawa USA works on U.S. Japan relations. I'd like to introduce the audience to some work that you're doing in the United States.
So Kodansha entered U.S. 1966, and we published many translations. For example, Haruki Murakami, also Nobel Prize laureate Kenzaburo Oe also. And we tied up with Penguin Random House in U.S. and to publish many kind of books. And I think in future, I believe that so a lot of possibilities of that. I think India, Japan, and U.S. can collaborate to make movies and animations, I think.
Oh, that's great. And my final question is your vision for the future Japan-India relationship, what your next project or goal is?
I don't have think about the next project.
Okay.
But so since 1980s, so India and Japan have collaborated in technology on the business front. And so it is evident that from friendly cooperation between the Prime Minister Modi of India and Prime Minister Abe of Japan, that Japan-India relationship is very strong, I think. Maybe it's going to getting better and better day by day. So the next step in this is, I think, a cultural exchange. Because at the moment, in general, Indian people do not much about Japanese culture and Japanese people beyond our automotive industry and high technological skills. Also, similarly, we love Indian curries, and also we know that the origin of Buddhism is India. But not so many Japanese people know much about India, Indian culture and Indian people. So I think, I'm sure that Japanese contents like manga, such as manga and comics, maybe will provide a window to Japan for Indian people, I think. And I think I truly expect very much our project would be an opportunity to improve people's understanding of Japanese and Japanese people, I think.
Thank you very much, and I hope the audience got a glimpse of Mr. Koga's work in trying to facilitate cultural exchanges and mutual understanding between the people of the two countries. So we're out of time. If I could request for a round of applause for Mr. Koga.
Thank you very much, Kazuo-san and Koga-san, for a very informative conversation. I was wondering how you were going to convert a baseball movie into a cricket movie, but I was convinced it looked very authentic, so thanks very much. Next, I would like to introduce our panel of speakers. If you could, because it'll take a little bit of time, please come up to the stage and we'll get you mic'd up as I'm introducing you. Today, we're very fortunate to have as our moderator Paul Beckett, who's the Washington Bureau Chief of the Wall Street Journal. Before taking the helm of the Washington Bureau in 2017, Mr. Beckett was the Asia editor in charge of the journal's print and digital editorial operations. And before that, he lived for 6 years in New Delhi as the South Asia editor for the journal based in New Delhi, and was responsible for creation of the Wall Street Journal website on India, among other accomplishments. We also have, as our first speaker, Raja Mohan, the director of Carnegie, India. And Raja is known as one of India's leading analysts on foreign policy. He's an expert on South Asian security, great power relations in Asia, and also arms control issues. He's also a foreign affairs columnist for the India Express. And then our second speaker will be Sumona Guha, who is the Senior Director of the U.S. India Business Council, and her role there is to assist U.S. companies to identify opportunities to strengthen U.S.-India business ties. But Sumona also had a long career in the State Department prior to her present job, and her last position at State, she was in the Secretary of State's policy planning staff, responsible for India, South Asia, and Central Asia strategy development. And then finally, our last speaker is Ambassador Akitaka Saiki. He has a very long resume, and I'm not going to read all of his accomplishments. It's in your program, so please take a look. His final position was Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs. But I do want to let you in on a little secret about Saiki-san, and that is that we have a wonderful alliance relationship with Japan. It's gone very well for 60 years, but that doesn't just happen naturally. There's a lot of hard work on both sides, particularly our respective foreign ministries, defense ministries, and the White House and the Prime Minister's office. And as someone who spent over 30 years of my career on U.S.-Japan relations in the State Department, one secret we have that I'll share with all of you is we identify champions and partners on the other side to whom we can turn when we have troublesome issues. And Mr. Saiki, for years, was our go-to person. And the reward for that, because he was so flexible and so much of a problem solver and so strong in the bureaucracy, the reward for that is we kept coming to him more and more often to help us solve issues. So he was one of the busiest people in the foreign ministry. But the result of his hard work, I think, was a much stronger U.S.-Japan security alliance. So we're very happy to have such an illustrious panel today, and I'll turn things over now to Paul.
Thank you very much, Steve. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I would be delighted to introduce Raja for his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. It's a delight to be here, and I wanted to thank the Sasakawa USA for inviting me to be part of this event. Now, the issues at hand, I think what we have is a very wide canvas on India-US relationship, India-Japan, and how the three of us are trying to shape the new Indo-Pacific region. Before I get into these specific points, I think I just wanted to say that the India's relationship with Japan has been one of the quickest growing and the most substantive relationships today. And that has evolved in tandem with India's expanded engagement with the United States. So it's both these bilateral tracks have proceeded parallel in a parallel fashion. And today what we're seeing is actually the three countries working together. And I think we're just beginning a process where the three of us work together to shape the Eastern Hemisphere, if I might put it that way. What I'll do is really to touch upon 5 basic themes on this vast canvas and to leave it there so that we can take it forward. I think the first set of points I want to make is in relation to history, a history that I think it's often forgotten about India and Japan. That actually for India and the emergence of Indian nationalism a century ago, Japan was very much a part of that story, that Japan was the first modernizer of Asia. Japan was the first society that transcended the old order and built a modern society. And Japan is also, when 1905, when Japan defeated Russia, that was also seen as the first victory by an Asian power against a European power. Forget the kind of the very nationalist element to this, but I think it quite inspired Indians saying that, look, it's the beginning of a very different Asia that's going to emerge. And some of the early ideas about Asia, of Asian unity, of Asian solidarity, largely came again in the interactions between poets, Indian poet like Rabindranath Tagore and Okakura Tenshin, that the emergence of a new consciousness about Asia as a place, as a culture, as a history, that really started just around the interwar period. And I think many of the initial ideas came from the interaction between the Indians and the Japanese. I think after the Second World War, again, I think during the Second World War, that story again, I think we don't want to talk much about, or certainly the Japanese don't want to talk about it. But the fact is that a large section of the Indian national movement actually worked with the Japanese. So actually the Southeast Asia was blessed with 2 Indian armies, one that was fighting to defeat the Japanese, and the other that was actually working with the British to overthrow working with the Japanese army to overthrow the British colonial rule in India. So I think it was a complex dynamic, but the fact is that unlike in Northeast Asia, I think there is no rancor against Japan's role in the Second World War, and actually there is a considerable goodwill that Japan was a potential partner for India in the transformation and the liberation of India from the colonial rule. And after the war, and I think as we went into the United Nations and these various new international order, India was one of the few countries that said, look, Japan should not be isolated. Unlike many Asian countries, just as Nehru said, China should not be isolated, whether it is communist or not, Japan cannot be isolated. That you cannot construct a stable Asian order without full and normal participation of Japan in it. For many, it's a controversial idea until recently, but I think for Nehru, saw it quite clearly that both China and Japan must be part of any order that we construct in Asia. Therefore, Nehru waived any demands on reparation from the Japanese, and that there was a lot of goodwill, and including Abe-san's uncle, who first visit he made to India. So there was actually a lot of goodwill in the 50s between the two sides. But I think as India turned inward and Japan rose, I think slowly we drifted apart. What we've seen happen in the last 15 odd years is really a restoration of a natural, genuine connectivity between the two countries. And I think the story has only just begun. I would think there's a lot that the two countries are going to do together. The second aspect I want to talk about is geography, which is what the Indo-Pacific idea that when Mr. Trump talked about it during his visit to Asia last November, I mean, a lot of people were surprised. But I think sitting where we are, I mean, I think for us, it's not such a shocking notion that for too long, we've seen South Asia and East Asia as different. We've seen the Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean as different realms. But again, if you go back to the Second World War, there was something called the Burma-China-India theater that was really encompassed largely the Bay of Bengal and the South China Sea today. And it was the intersection where the Japanese armies that were knocking at the gates of India, the Chinese who had eastern coast was blocked, they were working with the Americans and the British Indian Army, that actually it was a collaboration between India, US, UK, and China to roll back the Japanese aggression. So I mean, you're talking about, I mean, it tells you that these were not separate places, that actually it is because China and India turned inwards that you had the breakup of this, what was a single connected domain, and the rise of China and the slower emergence of India over the last few years. I think it made it inevitable that China will have a larger role in the Indian Ocean. India's interests in the Pacific are growing. Therefore, this space is going to be seen as a single theater one more time. So how we define it, I mean, I don't want us to get trapped in that definitional part of it, but to see that, look, there is the traditional notions of how we map this region must change, and they're changing because of structural factors like China's rise, India's interest, and globalization of Asia itself has made the seas very, very important for Asia's trade. Therefore, you're beginning to see an integration of the space that is taking place. The second, there's another aspect to Indo-Pacific, which is really the idea of, it's not just about geography, it's not about a new geopolitics that's emerging, it's also about values. It's also about creating some norms, it's about creating a rules-based order, about keeping the sea lines of communication open. So these are the kind of issues that when we say a free and open Indo-Pacific, which the Americans today supported, the Japanese have led the initiative, and India is very much part of it. So I think these two are different elements, but I think Indo-Pacific is as a general grab-all term that really talks about a new emerging geography. And within that, and we're not talking about setting up another international institution, another set of treaties, but it's really about shaping this region by cooperation among the major powers. The third, I mean, I think element is that the power structure of the Indo-Pacific is changing fundamentally. I think China's rise, China is today the second largest economy, soon to be the number one. You have many of the large economies are going to be increasingly in the East. That the G7, if a future G7 would have very few of the current members of the Europe there. So you're talking about a huge structural shift to the East in terms of where the economic activity is generated. And I think here that the rise of China is the principal story here. While India is also emerging, Indonesia is emerging, a whole lot of countries are emerging. It's really the dramatic expansion of the Chinese material capabilities in the last 30 years that have created a huge power imbalance. I want to be careful what I say, that is a reality. It's not a question of saying whether it's good or bad. The Chinese are the second largest economy, the second largest defense budget, that they want to be a great power. I don't think any one of us can grudge them the right to be a great power. And they're going to come into the Indian Ocean, they're going to project power. Just as we saw all the trading nations before us, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French, the British, and the Americans, the Chinese power projection will take place. Now the question is, how do we deal with the consequences? It's not to go into the arguments about the Chinese intentions, whether they're good or bad, but the question is, there is a power shift, and how do we manage that power shift? Are we going to create a new, a set of rules where there can be limits on China's unilateral exercise of power? I'll just give you one example. When we had the law of the sea, Philippines went to the court, permanent court of arbitration. The Chinese lost the argument on every one of the counts, unanimously in the permanent court of arbitration. Did that make a difference? Not yet. So there are going to be consequences to the current power shift. And unless all of us come together and say, look, it's not about containing China. China is too big to be contained. But the fact is that there must be some coalition that stands for some values in which eventually we can hope China can be part of it. But at this point, that constructing that coalition is what we are talking about when the Japanese talk about a rules-based order, when the Americans talk about a free and open Indo-Pacific, or India supports that. What we're talking about is how do we create a new balance within this region, and I think that is the core objective that we need to work for. So how do we do this? That brings me to the fourth point about strategy. How do we deal with if the objectives are quite clear, that we need a balance, and we need a set of legal, political, institutional arrangements that would prevent the assertion of power by one power against the smaller countries around it. And I think that is the big question. What we've seen happen in the last few years, the Americans have talked about a pivot. Today they're talking about an Indo-Pacific strategy. So I think people are scrambling to deal with the new situation. But I would say any strategy, I think, to achieve these two objectives must necessarily involve one or two things. I think we're not going to set up another APEC type of organization. A treaty is not going to solve the problem. Some of our friends in Indonesia think, you need one more treaty. So this is not about making fresh treaties or fresh institutions, but can the critical actors in the region come together to pool their resources, to be able to structure at least a countervailing capacity that would lead to some balance in the region. So until now, this function has largely been done by the Americans, both in the Indian Ocean and in the Pacific Ocean. The United States, in fact, if you talked about the architecture, I think there was only one word for it. It's called the U.S. Navy, perhaps to say that the U.S. Navy was the force in the Indian Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, and the American power, which replaced the British, after '68 in the Indian Ocean, and in the East, of course, after the Second World War, the U.S. Was the principal power. Now, if that structure, can it survive? And I think there are questions. Not we asking those questions, but the Americans are asking those questions. How much of a forward presence are you going to do? Is this in the interest of American people? That I think these are questions, whether we like it or not, in the East. This is a part of the American political argument today. And that how much we might think in this part of the town that, look, there is an autonomy from what the other people think in this country. But I think what we've seen happen in the last year and a half is really that there are questioning of the core assumptions of American forward military presence. So therefore, the others in the region, I think, we have to get together. It's not that nobody's expecting the Americans to go. I think that America will stay in Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean for the foreseeable future. But I think that we need to do more in the region. That's precisely what we've seen. Japan take some leadership, for example, on the TPP issue. India is doing some things, like on the Solar Alliance. We're working with the French to create how to deal with some of the issues that have emerged after the US walked out of the climate change accord. So I think that India, Japan, and Australia and countries of the region, we need to take more responsibilities. And that's where the story that while the US presence is necessary, that we need to do more so that the US role here can be sustained. Because whichever way you look at it to the future, some diminution of the American role, I think, is inevitable. I think that argument can be contested. But anyone who thinks that the last 70 years are going to be the guide for the next 70 years of American forward military presence or of the American weight in the regional affairs, then I think that will be a mistaken notion. So therefore, the right thing to do is for us in Asia who have the capabilities to be able to step forward and do what we can, some in a lot in partnership with the Americans, a lot on our own, so that you actually create a reasonable in situ balance of power system there. So that brings me to the last point, which is really the idea of burden sharing. That if the US debate today is really about asking friends and partners, what have you done for me lately? And US President posing the question that, look, trade and security are linked, that the US is not going to forever keep its markets open for you to grow and then depend on me for security, and everything, all the burden comes on the American working people. I mean, that is the argument in the heartland here today. I don't know that argument is going to last for too long, or that might change, but the fact is that the idea of burden sharing, which we heard before in the 70s vis-a-vis NATO, Mr. Nixon talked about it as a Nixon doctrine, the Asian countries taking more responsibilities. And in each of the time, I think the US came back in a full force, I mean, to be able to do things on its own. But today, I think there is no excuse for countries like India or Japan, for Australia, to merely say, we have this beautiful right to criticize the Americans for everything they do with absolute confidence, they're not going anywhere. I think that story, that we have the luxury of American forward military presence, with the American leadership on trade and other issues, and we can only sit back and criticize them, but expect that the Americans will carry regardless of what happens outside or inside the country. And I think the situation is changing. Therefore, countries like Asia, countries like India, Australia, Indonesia, whoever it is in the region, are taking more burden to secure a reasonable balance of our system, and the rules-based order becomes central, and I think that is the story. So while the US will be very much part of the Indo-Pacific story for the next 50 years, it will also involve Japan doing more, India doing more, and contributing to the peace and prosperity in the Eastern Hemisphere.
Terrific. Thank you very much for your opening remarks. Fascinating perspective. We will turn to Sumona next, and the ambassador after that, after which we will open it up to questions. We'll have a roundtable discussion, and then we'll open up to questions at the end. Sumona, could you give us the business perspective on that, please?
Sure. Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Raja, and many thanks to the Sasakawa Foundation for bringing us all together. I think it's a very timely and important topic. So I'll be looking at the question of the Indo-Pacific region and the Indo-Pacific strategy from my perspective as a senior director at the U.S. India Business Council. So we are an industry association. We have about 300 member companies, primarily U.S. companies, some Indian companies, that do business back and forth. So our goal is to increase trade and investment between the U.S. and India. As Ambassador Zumwalt mentioned, I spent many years at the State Department, most recently in the policy planning staff, where I had the privilege of working on things like creating more and deeper dialogues between the U.S. and India, adding a commercial component to the strategic dialogue. It was a very robust time in U.S.-India relations where we created some, across all areas, 80-some bilateral dialogues, many of which are still continuing. They might have different names, but the conversations are still continuing. And so it's a great period of strong U.S.-India ties. So I would just start by saying the term Indo-Pacific is not new. We've seen it over the last few years, certainly. And I would point to two sort of implications from U.S. foreign policy and an industry perspective. The first, and probably most obvious, is that we should think about South Asia and East Asia as one geographic region. That might sound obvious, but actually in the U.S. system, bureaucratically, we are not set up to deal with South Asia and East Asia as one. At the State Department, where I was, we have different bureaus that handle South Asia and East Asia. The Pentagon on the policy side, we have an Asia bureau that handles both, but the military is divided differently. Our combatant commands split between, let's see, Afghanistan and Pakistan's in Central Command, India's in Pacific Command. At the White House National Security Council, we have one office that deals with East Asia Pacific affairs, one office that deals with South Asia, including Afghanistan and Pakistan. So that's just the bureaucratic piece from the US perspective. But secondly, and more importantly, I think the term Indo-Pacific, I think really from a US perspective, emphasizes the primacy of India as a major democracy in Asia and as a pillar of the Asian landscape. This is Indo-Pacific versus Asia-Pacific, a more common term. So what does this mean in practice? It means that the US is looking at India not only as a bilateral partner, but also as a partner in looking at the rest of the world, managing global challenges wherever they might erupt, and playing a larger role in sort of global governance and how do we manage things that fall into the global commons. And Raja alluded to this. it is a question of, what partners does the U.S. have to discuss issues and perhaps cooperate on issues of the international order, freedom of navigation, trade, human rights, all sorts of issues. Again, how do you discuss and find partnerships? So from my perspective at the U.S.-India Business Council, an important element of this approach is desire to foster deeper economic ties among the countries in the Indo-Pacific region. So that's both among the countries in South Asia and between the countries in South Asia and Southeast Asia to create contiguous economic space. The term that's being used, as it's being used now in this administration, I think it affects an ambition to develop new incentives for infrastructure investment, support for infrastructure projects that would connect the region. The former Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, gave a major policy speech in which he actually spoke about a desire to create alternative financing vehicles to foster this kind of infrastructure investment. He's no longer in his position, but of course we've seen over several months that there's enough support for this concept. I think they've managed to operationalize it, and there does seem to be an effort underway to think about what resources the U.S. government has, and then marry that up with resources in India and resources in Japan. Again, as Raja alluded to, pooling our respective resources to fulfill this objective. And there are incentives for all three countries to look at the Indo-Pacific this way. The U.S. stands to benefit by creating additional opportunities for U.S. companies, including developing new export markets. There's the idea of job creation, which is a compelling political issue in the United States as well as in India. And so the idea is to look and see what resources we have through our national development finance institutions. So on the U.S. side, that would include OPIC, EXIM, U.S. Trade and Development Agency, programs out of Department of Commerce, USAID, and marry that up potentially with what's available in India through the National Infrastructure Investment Fund, through the Indian EXIM Bank. Japan and India have very strong cooperation on this front already, so I think the U.S. would like to see where the U.S. could play a productive role in supplementing that strong partnership. And of course, Japanese development agencies very active in India. And then alongside the development finance institutions, you also have, of course, the multilateral development banks, which support infrastructure projects. So the World Bank, IFC, Asian Development Bank, New Development Bank. How can you marry up the incentives so that the projects that the multilateral development banks support and the national development finance institutions support actually fulfill this strategic objective of the governments to create this kind of infrastructure? How can the multilateral development banks de-risk projects so that there are more private sector incentives to come in and work on these long-term infrastructure projects? So the U.S.-India Business Council is working with the U.S. Japan Business Council, which is also part of the Chamber of Commerce, where we are, and the Indian Trade Association, FICCI, and I think we have a representative from FICCI here today. So our three organizations are working together to create a series of conversations between industry and between the three governments as they develop their strategy. What we hear from our companies is that there's significant interest in investing in these types of infrastructure projects, but it's a matter of getting the de-risking, finding the right partners, building consortiums. So you have a lot of private capital that is interested in coming in. So how do we have the conversations to leverage the U.S. financing, again, coming back to leveraging institutions, organizations that already exist. And we're looking at, a number of different sectors. We alluded to strong security cooperation between the U.S., India, and Japan, and I think that piece is very well developed, and certainly from the perspective of defense companies, there may be additional opportunities there. we're looking at infrastructure, which is a big component of this, I think, from the U.S. side, from the strategy. And so we have conversations with our infrastructure companies, our private equity companies, our insurance companies who actually hold a lot of capital and are looking for long-term, sort of 20, 30-year investments for the resources that they're responsible for. Trying to pull these, establish these conversations so that as the governments think about their strategy, they can really be informed by what industry needs to take these risks and start doing these projects. But as we've started, we've gotten a lot of interest from other sectors as well. We're obviously talking about infrastructure connectivity, sort of hard connectivity. In terms of soft connectivity, our IT firms are very interested. There's discussions going on. Data privacy is a big issue everywhere. Could the three countries discuss how to harmonize their data privacy regulations in order to make it easier to exchange information among them? We've had interest from our healthcare companies who want to be sure that there is sufficient infrastructure for the delivery of healthcare services. So as we have these conversations, we're finding deep interest by industry in seeing how they can be a part and ultimately make sure the strategy is implemented. So I'll stop there.
Terrific. Thank you very much indeed. Ambassador.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA for hosting this very important workshop this morning. I'm very glad to be back in Washington, D.C., see many good old friends and also some new friends here in this room. Ambassador Jim Zumwalt and I have been friends for many, many years. He has revealed many secrets about our partnership, friendship in the span of many years. We worked very hard as diplomats to strengthen the Japan-U.S. alliance for many years. One thing he did not reveal about our secret is that Jim and I went to same high school in Japan. He was one of the exchange students, and of course I didn't know him at that time. Cannot imagine young Jim Zumwalt wearing the high school uniform of Japanese students at that time, but he was really a serious student at that time. By the way, Tokyo cherry blossoms season is over. Entire last week we enjoyed the cherry blossoms in Tokyo. Now cherry blossom season in Washington has started, and Jim knows very well about the timing of this workshop. I'm going to enjoy the cherry blossoms here in Washington again. So thank you very much for that, Jim. My very brief presentation is about Japanese views on Japan-India relationship, first of all, and also Indo-Pacific partnership. I'm very used to speaking on the off-the-record basis, actually, because of my career in the past. I know that this is on-the-record basis. I see some journalists in this room, so I'll be speaking very carefully in making my presentation.
No need to do that, no.
But don't misquote me, okay? I have some slides to share with you this morning. Let me go to the first one. Am I right? Are you showing the correct one? No? How about this? Okay. Sorry, this is not animation. When we talk about the Indo-Pacific partnership, you see 5 important political leaders in this image. Among these 5 political leaders, individual friendship is different. Some are close friends and some are not, yet. One thing clear is Mr. Abe, Prime Minister Abe, Japanese Prime Minister, is a very close friend with at least 3 of the figures here in this image. But I have no doubt that he will become good friends with the 4th figure in the picture. Now let me focus a little bit on Japan-India relationship. Prime Minister Abe and Prime Minister Modi, they have known each other for nearly 5 years now, I think. He became Prime Minister of India after I left. I served as ambassador to India between 2011 and 2012, just a year and a half. But after the elections in India, Mr. Modi became Prime Minister. I have known him, of course, when he was Chief Minister in the state of Gujarat, where I visited several times to see him. But in any case, Prime Minister Abe and Mr. Modi became very good friends. And they have a clear vision, clear shared vision about Japan-India relationship, and a clear vision about the region as a whole, Asia and Indo-Pacific. Thanks to the very strong leadership of these two prime ministers, Japan and India, its relationship has been elevated to special strategic and global partnership. That's what we call our bilateral partnership now. Sorry about many words here. Those who are sitting in the distance cannot read the small letters. Pardon me for that. First of all, business relationship between Japan and India. It's growing every year. Japanese investments, the FDI, foreign direct investment from Japan into India, leaped from 2.6 billion US dollars in the year 2015, 3 years ago, to 4.7 billion US dollars in 2016. So just in 1 year, it almost doubled the amount of the foreign direct investment from Japan to India. The number of Japanese companies operating in India is steadily increasing. When I was in India in the year 2011, the number of Japanese companies in India was about 800. Last year, the number has increased to 1,369, according to JETRO counting. So from 800 to nearly 1,400. Small, medium-sized business. They are going out to India to establish their presence and to do business with the Indian counterparts. Japan and India are working together very closely, both at the government level and at the private sector level. We are working on high-speed railway between Mumbai and Ahmedabad. This is the first bullet train system with a Japanese financing and technology introduced into India. We are working on developing a huge economic zone connecting Chennai and Bangalore. We are carrying out defense and security cooperation through a joint maritime exercise called Malabar Exercise. Originally, this Malabar exercise was a joint exercise between US and Indian navies. And then India agreed that Japan join to make this exercise a trilateral maritime exercise. But most importantly, Japan and India are working together to achieve a free and open Indo-Pacific. We share the following key principles in developing this concept. There are 5. One is openness. Number 2 is transparency. Number 3 is respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity. Number 4 is respect for international law and standards. And number 5 is respect for environment. We are working together in the Asia-Pacific region and also in the East African region. I think the image will show where we are trying to achieve this concept of free and open Indo-Pacific. The ultimate purpose of this strategy is to create an alliance of like-minded democratic nations in the region. This includes economic development, such as strengthening of trade ties, increasing foreign direct investment, infrastructure development, and so forth. But it is about more than just the creation of a large economic sphere of influence. As we see in the TPP endeavor, we're not just creating a trade and investment sphere. We're trying to create a region where we abide by international law. We allow free and open investment and trade flows. This is about building a strategic alliance of free and open states that operate under universally accepted rules. When it comes to economic activity in general, such as trade, investment, and research and development, who makes the rules? Who determines what the rules of the game are going to be? For most countries, this usually involves a process of negotiating as equal partners, as equal players, a set of rules that are acceptable to all parties. When one big country or one large economy attempts to impose its own set of rules or a way of thinking on a region or regions, we call it unilateralism. This is not imposition by way of law or some sort of moral superiority, but rather an imposition by way of force through a leveraging of its position of power. In democracies, the position of power rests with its political leaders. And for those leaders, a democracy is not the best system when you're looking to get things done. This is because a democracy is by nature a political system that tolerates criticism and dissent against its own political leaders. However, by entrenching concepts such as freedom of thought and freedom of expression, a democracy creates the requisite and perhaps most important conditions for both individuals and groups to prosper and thrive, and this is what makes it so strong. India is the largest democracy in the world. Its population is nearing 1.4 billion, 10 times more than Japan's population. And it is continuing to grow. Fully half of its population is under 30 years of age. And as a young country, its growth potential is substantial. India also continues to maintain its market-based economy and an open democratic political system. Japan and India enjoy convergence of grand strategies. We'd like to expand the notion of free and open Indo-Pacific strategy together with the United States in a trilateral cooperation, and together with Australia in a Quad cooperation. We welcome many countries in the region, in the Pacific region, to join hands with us as long as they keep the 5 principles of the strategy which I just mentioned to you. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you to all 3 of our panelists for their opening remarks, and we will now have a roundtable discussion. Please feel free to jump in on any question, and then we'll open it up to the audience for questions and wrap up around 2 o'clock. Raja and Ambassador, maybe we could talk about this. When we discussed, the big motivating force for this have been what we like to call the bromance between Prime Minister Abe and Prime Minister Modi. These are democracies, as you've repeatedly noted, so their political futures as leaders will be limited. And Raja, you were saying this isn't really an area for necessarily treaties or anything formal. How can we be sure that any of this will last beyond the natural political lives of the 2 prime ministers?
Go ahead, I'll follow you.
Yeah. Since I think both the Prime Minister Abe and Prime Minister Modi can't change the constitution to give themselves a permanent position. So there is a terminal quality to all elected leaderships. So I think the question is, look, will it survive the kind of energy that Abe-san has brought to Japanese strategy in the region? Would it also survive Mr. Modi, who's kind of shed many of the historic inhibitions of India to work with Western democracies? My sense is, I think, what is driving this in a structural sense is really the power shift that is taking place. One, the dramatic rise of China, which we noted. There is growing uncertainty about the U.S. role. That I think is equally significant. I mean, I think while the China's rise is quite clear and its intentions, what it says about its maritime rights, about its wanting to be a great power, that's quite clear. It's not at all clear what the U.S. is going to do. So therefore, I think given this uncertainty that is generated by the most important powers in the region, the others, I think, will have to find a way of working together. That's pooling resources on a range of military, economic issues, and politically finding ways to coordinate. So therefore, any structure that emerges here as the 2 largest economies, Japan and India, and working with others, will have to find a way of, if they want to retain the position. Because the Chinese friends, I mean, occasionally say there's only one tiger on the mountain, and they say, look, India, Japan can't really deserve seats on the Security Council. I mean, that's kind of understanding if they have. The only way to deal with that is that we get together to do more things. So I would think this would survive the current policies, because what is changing is the deep structure of Asia is changing. And in that the only way for any sense of balance would be if Japan and India take the leadership and work with the United States wherever possible and supplement the US role by doing more things themselves.
Ambassador, your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. I agree with what Raja just said. Rise of China is inevitable for all of us. Politically, economically, and militarily, China is rising rapidly. It could, of course, pose a threat to many countries in the region, but we cannot stop China from running very fast. At the same time, we see the decline of, well, decline may be a strong word, decline of Europe and Americans' influence in the world. European countries and United States used to lead the world by making many constructive proposals and initiatives, and to create the universally acceptable system. But we don't see that kind of leadership role now, unfortunately, from Washington or from London or from other capitals in Europe. So when China rises and when US and Europe decline, we see political vacuums created here and there. Instability we have to see in some parts in Asia, or in the Middle East, or in Africa. We do hope strongly that civilized nations, advanced industrialized economies, would join their hands together to sustain the system that we have maintained for the last 73 years.
Sumona, if I get you, we have, you talked about economic ties and multilateral efforts, and obviously economic ties are going to be extremely tight, especially where there are treaties. There's a treaty that Australia is part of, there's a treaty that Japan is part of. In the TPP, it does not include the United States, and it does not include India. To what degree isn't that an impediment to what we're talking about here? Because you really have against a lot of people's expectations, I think, 11 countries that worked extremely hard to make that happen, and that's only half of the people that we're talking about in what we consider the Indo-Pacific Partnership. So how does that, is that an impediment or is that an opportunity?
Certainly, developing regional trade and having trade across all the regions is an important component of how you would envision the Indo-Pacific Partnership. And as you correctly point out, the United States, India are not part of TPP. India is in negotiations on the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, another different regional bloc. Investment is also another important part of it, which is not governed by these multilateral treaties. There are some bilateral treaties in place, or there's just investment happening without the protections that would be built into investment treaties. Certainly, it is desirable to have as much trade as possible among the countries, but I think that the investment piece is also important and can help build those economic ties.
If I could just stick with you for a second. If you look at China's One Belt, One Road policy, I mean, that is effectively economic foreign policy, and it involves massive infrastructure investments, including in Pakistan and in areas all around India. The way you described the way forward for infrastructure investment, it sounded admirable, but it sounded really quite based on an awful lot of cooperation and an awful lot of organization and an awful lot of multilateralism. Can that approach really compete with a effectively state-sponsored economic foreign policy that One Belt, One Road represents?
I think it will manifest in different ways. So I should step back and say, from industry's perspective, they will look for opportunities. And so I imagine that there are companies that are working with One Belt, One Road. This is happening. But as you say, that's a state effort. The United States does not work that way. It's not, no matter who is in power, the United States does not organize itself so that the governments provide this kind of private investment. It's really the strength of our private sector that we're looking to leverage in this situation within existing rules. And so I think it will manifest, again, it will require a lot of cooperation and coordination, and this is what we see emerging between the three governments, but it will manifest itself differently. If you look at statistics of US private investment in some of these countries, it's quite impressive. We don't add it all up and say it's the United States doing it. So I think it will manifest differently.
I don't want to speak for Japan, but the Japanese have a major initiative also called the Partnership for Quality Infrastructure. PQI is a difficult set of acronym, but there is, and the Japanese have put at least $130–140 billion on the table for infrastructure projects in the region. And I think Japanese have a much longer, more credible experience of doing projects in third countries, because much of the infrastructure in China and Southeast Asia was largely done with the Japanese assistance over the last many decades. So I think if, for example, I think Ambassador talked about a high-speed rail corridor that Japan is developing in India. So if we can demonstrate some of these projects as successful and that they're being done on a more sustainable basis, then I think there is because people want choices. At this point, if you say, look, it's the Chinese are winning everywhere, therefore they're putting in money, they're doing all kinds of things, but there are questions also being raised, even in Pakistan. The questions of interest rates, what are the kind of interest rates the Pakistanis are charging? Or the experience of Sri Lanka, where it has been driven deep into debt, and that has led to ceding territorial control over its bases, etc. So I think for us is can we pool our resources, can we work together to do projects to show that there's a different way of doing it? To some extent, I think India, Japan are working together in Sri Lanka, in Bangladesh places to see, look, whether we can work together to do some infrastructure projects. Now, the idea that the three of us should work together, that's being discussed, I believe, last month in Washington, and that will be taken further. There is also the India-Japan are talking about an Asia-Africa growth corridor, where we can pool our resources and do interesting things. And there are also other countries like France and Germany are beginning to take interest. So I think you've got to start somewhere. And if you can demonstrate one or two successes, I think, because people would love to have choices. I mean, that if you say, look, if I can negotiate with both China and Japan, I would love that, rather than saying there's only one banker in town, it's always a problem.
You said, let's see if we can. How optimistic are you that we can?
No, I would say we're quite close to doing some specific projects in Sri Lanka. If we can do one or two of those, and if the rail project in, the high-speed thing, I was told that it is moving very well. It should be done ahead of target between Mumbai and Ahmedabad. So I think we'll have some success. And India is also putting some money in the region. So I think the thing is to demonstrate, as I said, one or two projects. And I'm sure in the next 3-4 years, we should be able to demonstrate something.
Ambassador, one of Prime Minister Modi's promises when he came to power was to make it easier for foreign companies to do business in India. You're a board member of Mitsubishi, I understand. Have you seen that? Do you think Japan Inc. has seen that over the 5 years of Modi's government?
Yes, absolutely. I think Prime Minister Modi has taken a very strong leadership role. He's playing a very strong leadership role in dismantling some of the barriers and also relaxing many regulations at the central level and also at the local governance level. I think he has made the foreign companies to come into India by way of investment or by way of trading much easier than before. And that's why I said that the number of Japanese presence is increasing dramatically in the last 5-6 years.
Sumona, what about your American members as they look for opportunities in India? Have they seen an improvement in conditions?
Absolutely. I mean, I would say over the last few years, you've seen a lot of positive policy changes in different sectors, whether it's opening for more investment across different sectors or just ease of doing business. India's ease of doing business has improved dramatically in the World Bank rankings, went up 30 spots. So yes, our members are definitely seeing the positive changes. They're still talking, there's room for discussion, of course, always, but yes.
Well, and what do you see as the areas that are most promising? Actually, probably both U.S. and Japan have made huge technology investments in India. I think SoftBank seems to be buying pretty much everything. U.S. companies obviously have been opening plants. Ford's opened its plant in Gujarat. Where are the key opportunities that you see, and if any business people come to you and say, what business should I be in India right now that is the most interesting? What do you recommend?
I mean, almost every sector. We work with companies that work across every sector, and many of them are in it. They've made the strategic bet on India, and they'll be there for the long term. We also have a number of companies across, every sector you can imagine, who are coming to us to explore opportunities.
Ambassador?
I agree with you. India is a huge country. Population is increasing. every year. I think it is leaping, and it may surpass the Chinese population in a matter of 2 or 3 years, I guess. But as I said earlier, the population is very young, and there is potential, huge potential for even further growth economically. I think the sectors like agriculture also have a huge potential for further development. Japanese private sector is in there to assist the upgrading of the agriculture. High-tech industry is also very, very promising. It is already flourishing in India, Bangalore and other cities in India. Manufacturing of automobiles and other high-tech products are also taking place. So I think all in all, Indian market is very, very promising to foreign investors. That's my view.
Is the criticism fair that Japan was a very early investor in India, particularly in consumer electronics and automobiles, but actually was really surpassed by Korea for some time? And if that criticism is fair, what is Japan doing to get that back?
I don't think the Japanese business people are competing with the Koreans. We would rather be competing with their own, what do you call the compatriots. Japanese business finds its credible partner in India. Other than that, you can't do business in India. You need to find reliable, credible partners. And that is, I think, the key to success to do business in India. And we are not much worried about foreign competitors there.
As many of your members are looking, obviously we talked a lot about one-way trade. What about Indian investment in Japan?
So our members, we primarily work in the U.S.-India corridor, but we do work with large Indian companies who are increasingly looking at investments in the United States, and presumably would also be looking at Japan, although that's not necessarily our area. But you are seeing, interestingly, more Indian investment in the United States and resultant, job creation, and it helps two-way trade and investment.
Gotcha. Raja, what are the risks to this? How do we go backwards from here rather than forward?
No, I think collective action is always a problem. It's never easy to produce similar coordinated policies, and I think also given the Chinese power at this stage, I mean, it's always tempting to say, look, that there is a separate piece or a separate deal that you can make, and I think it's also all Chinese actions don't affect all four of us equally. Right? While India shares a 4,000 kilometer border with the Chinese, which has today become very live, that doesn't affect the way Australians or the Japanese but the Japanese have a huge maritime territorial dispute. The Americans and the Quad, shall we say, the Australians are far away. So I think there is always that problem that everyone doesn't appreciate a threat in the same manner. And I think that's where the difference, that how the West dealt with Soviet Russia. There was coherence, there was a shared threat, and Russia voluntarily opted out of the global economic system. But in this case, the China is the number 2 economy. I mean, the China is there, a largest trading partner to 130 countries. So dealing with China is going to be a lot more demanding and a lot more challenging. So that, I think, is where we will always find some difficulties. But I think if we keep doing small things of greater cooperation that we're talking today on infrastructure development, of providing assistance to other countries, capacity building in smaller places, minimal, start with some simple military cooperation like on HADR, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. If we can do some joint operations, the three of us, then I think you can create a structure over a period of time to be able to say, look, there is an alternative, there is some way of limiting unilateralism by one country, but it will take a lot of hard work. And then we also have a problem, well, Japan and the US are treaty allies, India is not, though we're beginning to have a substantive defense dialogue with the Americans, we have a 2+2 dialogue with the Japanese. So it's the traditions are different. The US would say, look, it wants to lead, it wants to control. The Japanese are very comfortable with the way working with the US. India is still learning how to do tough love with the Americans. So there are a whole lot of issues. But I would say, again, I would go back to the deep structure is changing, and it's so challenging for all across China's periphery that I think there will have to be a measure of cooperation.
What about the US perspective? A lot of certainly what we've been writing about and the world, I think, has been focusing on has been the presence and the US apparatus focus on China trade and on North Korea. Can you, between you, point to 2 or 3 concrete steps that the United States has taken in the last 50 months to foster exactly the Indo-Pacific aspect of this that we've been talking about? Ambassador, are you thinking, or are you?
No, I think we are at the very initial stage of making this a very substantial joint efforts. President Trump, I think in his speech in Vietnam a few months back, for the first time mentioned this Indo-Pacific strategy. And at the same time, he also stressed the importance of bilateral trade deficit and surplus issue. So I don't know where he stands, but anyway, India and Japan are working very close together in order to invite the United States coming with the same level of eagerness with the concrete projects that we can spread around in the region. Let me just add something about how we think about this OBOR concept you mentioned, called One Belt, One Road concept proposed by China. Chinese proposal is not, in our view, incompatible with the strategy that we are proposing in terms of Indo-Pacific strategy, as long as the Chinese proposal is open and free and respects the international law and standards.
Those are 3 fairly large caveats.
Yes, and it's not impossible for China to join hands with us. We're not excluding Chinese influence in the region at all. It is up to the individual countries or individual companies on the receiving end whether or not to accept the Chinese proposal or ours. But we can always work together as long as we have the common ground.
So have either of you seen other US concrete measures beyond what the ambassador said in terms of fostering this partnership?
I think you've seen it in the U.S. government in terms of the signals they're sending. There's a rhetorical piece, but also there seems to be some work going on, as I was alluding to, across different parts of the government to figure out what resources are available, trying to develop a collective strategy across the U.S. government, and then the pieces to coordinate pooling resources with the Indian and Japanese governments.
More on the military side and the security side, where the U.S. is the big strength. And because the absence of a private sector, I mean, the U.S. gets hamstrung on the economic side. But I would say it's promoting the Malabar exercises, the India-U.S. Japan trilateral. Many of these initiatives have largely come from the U.S. or now the Quad again.
Excellent. Thank you all for a very interesting discussion. Now let's open it up to the audience. We have microphones, I believe they're going around. I think it would be helpful for all of us if we could just learn who you are before you ask your questions. Sir, could I start? You've been very patient down here. There's a microphone right behind you.
Thank you very much for an excellent panel. Sherman Katz is my name. Most of my life I was a trade lawyer, and that colors this question perhaps. State-owned enterprises and state capitalism are the elephant in the room that we haven't talked very much about. After all, post-World War II, one of the reasons we've all done so well is we agreed on a common set of rules for operating the international economy. We hoped that when China joined WTO, it too would become more market-oriented. That hasn't happened. State-owned enterprises are an enormous factor globally. Do you think that any of the cooperation that you've been discussing should address this question? how we bring along. We won't stop China running fast, as you said, Mr. Ambassador, but should we at least be trying to play on the same playing field?
Whoever would like to answer.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, not me.
Go.
Ambassador.
I've spoken too much.
You really put one up there. Go ahead. Ambassador, go ahead.
You know, China has a unique system, different system from ours, politically and economically, as you mentioned. And it's becoming a huge giant, and its influence is really growing all over. And China's president has not hidden his ambition to make China dream come true by the year 2049. This is the year 100th anniversary of China's foundation from 1949. Now, as long as China's growth is matching the international standards and norms, I repeat again, but that's fine with us. The rise of China should not be feared too much by all of us. But what concerns us is that China does not seem to be keen to listen to different views and voices from within its own country. And that is certainly one of the concerns for us outside China. I cannot answer to your very difficult question entirely, but this is just a piece of my view that I want to share with you.
Thank you. Lead from Fiki, I think you had a question.
Thank you. My name is Ritika, and I represent the Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry. Also partnered with East-West Center for this report that most of you have. I just want to add to what Sumona was talking about on India, U.S., Japan infrastructure triad. We did the first meeting with the State Department almost a month ago, and to my surprise, when they went back, they were the MEA, the Indian Ministry of External Affairs. They were very keen to have an insight from the Indian private sector on how do they feel about an India, US, Japan infrastructure triad, meaning they were pleasantly surprised to see that there's a lot of excitement from Indian private sector for something like this. But if I have the permission of the panel to add something on India's perspective on this partnership, there is a war happening, a technology war happening between China and US. Where the Tencent and the Alibaba in comparison to the Alphabet and the Facebook and Amazons of the US. And there is a growing anxiety in India to gain from this technology war that's happening between China and US, where a lot of Indian tech companies feel comfortable enough to be having investments from SoftBank from Japan in comparison to Alibaba. So, and they are also trying to reach out to the AI community on how they can facilitate the working force on the AI space, whether that's in Europe or in America. So that's an interesting sort of aspect to look at when you're looking at India, Japan, or China, or US, and all of these countries. That's what I had to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comment. So could we have the microphone over here, please?
I don't really need one unless you're going to record it. It's still my fault, sir. Projection is not a problem with me. Sir, I am Guy Thomas. I am the retired former science advisor for the United States for Maritime Domain Awareness. At my retirement, both India and Japan paid me the honor of having people at my retirement. I've been trying to get people talking to join specifically in building a maritime domain awareness system for the entire world. But it strikes me, has for some time actually, that India and Japan, as a partnership, you're both very strong space companies as well. You're both very, JAXA and ISRO are among the top space organizations in the world. And that's critical in maritime domain awareness. There's been an explosion, if you don't know this, in technology and space in the last 10 years. We now are on the edge of being able to watch every ship in the world for every minute. Within 5 years, we're going to be able to see every ship with unclassified systems. We can't do it, I don't think, with classified. I'm not cleared for that anymore. But in India and Japan, especially India, with their launch capabilities, which rival Russia's in a lot of ways, are really excellent. Has anybody considered a partnership between Japan and India to build a maritime domain awareness system stretching from the Cape of Good Hope to the Horn of Africa, to the Hormuz, to the Kuril Islands, and bringing in every free and open country in the world to say we need to build this system here. The capability is right there today, my friends. It's just a political will, and I'm wondering if anybody stepped forward.
Just maritime domain awareness as a issue area has certainly, drawn a lot more attention, and I think for India it's become a major priority for its naval thing, and that it has been a major element of India's discussions with U.S. and Japan both, as well as with some of our other neighboring countries in the Indian Ocean. But it's interesting that you said about space-based MDA, that in fact last month when President Macron visited India, we had actually announced that France is also very good in space. So India and France have announced a program to develop a satellite system that would focus on maritime domain awareness. And yeah, so it just happened 3 weeks ago. And we hope that, I think the India-Japan too can work together. And Japanese have been trying quite hard to bring some of the European powers into the Quad arrangement, into the Indo-Pacific arrangement, especially Britain and France. Japan has been trying to draw them in. So I think there are possibilities. I'm glad you raised this issue. This is something I'm sure Saiki-san will not.
It's a very interesting suggestion that you made.
Japan has paid my way to Japan nearly every year for the last 6 years. 5 out of the last 6 years. Talk to us about that.
We'll let the two prime ministers, of course, including the President of the United States, to discuss this important matter together sometime when they meet trilaterally.
Sir, you had a question? Can we have the microphone down here, please?
Thank you. Steve Landy, Manchester Trade. I'm disappointed about one thing. That's a great slide you have over there on Africa-India trade. I'm sorry you didn't explain it, and we can't read it, but I walked over. Everybody should look at it. Africa's going to go up in population in this world from, 1.7 billion to 3.5 billion. There's already, I think you said 17% of the world, but that was quite a slide, so I compliment you. However, I am concerned, and I think some of this may be indicated by some of our moderators' questions. There's a lot of words being discussed about how we're going to compete with China, but there's not cooperatively, but there's nothing on the ground. The USTR is getting ready to mount a campaign against India because it's a deficit country. It has a surplus with the US, and it has a lot of trade restrictions, which India may feel is consistent with this development level. I don't want to go there, but we're not in a friendly area. If you look around at the resources that the US is going to be devoting to help, quote, Africa or help in development, it's going down, no matter how you look at it. You may marshal them better, but every government has tried to marshal them better for the last 10 administrations, I'm sure. There's moving. It's almost a joke, but you hear about the Indian-Japanese initiative towards Africa. When I go to Africa, I can't find it. I ask people in the foreign ministry. China has been in. China has doubled its diplomatic representation. Oh, we know India. The point I'm trying to make, I think, is what do you see concrete happening that is going to enable this cooperation? Because the sad fact of the matter is, in response to the question, how it's a shame that the United States is not participating with India and with Japan in the TPP. Japan and India are cooperating in the RCEP, the regional agreement with China. So they're in there and we're on the way out. So my only question is, do you have anything specific that will really make me feel positive, giving this administration's emphasis on U.S. domestic production? Thank you.
Can anyone reassure a friend here?
The only thing I can say to you at this point is that this is a developing sort of initiative, and the private sector has to be on board from both countries, India and Japan. And we welcome the American business sector to, come on board with us. And Africa, as you mentioned, with this huge population, and it is still at the very underdeveloped stage, and there are many sectors from industry to agriculture, with potential all over. And there is a strong Indian presence in Africa, for that matter, in the eastern part of Africa. So I think we can develop joint programs and projects to work together in that part of the continent. But we have to wait for the individual companies to express their interest and will to participate.
So you see the private sector key to that too?
Hmm?
I was asking Sumona, do you see the private sector as key to that as well?
Right, I mean, I do see the private sector as key. I mean, obviously, I agree, it's a strategy that's under development. I think as three democracies, it will take us perhaps a little bit longer, but the effort is there, the political will seems to be there, and we are, as I said in my remarks, seeing a lot of interest from industry, and over time, expect to see more concrete examples.
Thank you. Other questions? Sir.
Thank you very much for giving a chance. My name is Satoru Nagao, Hudson Institute. My question is a little different topic to Ambassador Saiki. What do you think about cherry blossom diplomacy? China used panda diplomacy. So we need to find something. Is this a weapon worth? Thank you.
Sorry, what was your proposed alternative to panda diplomacy?
To tackle the panda diplomacy, we need to plant more cherry blossoms. Is it
Cherry
good
blossom
idea?
diplomacy. Thank you.
See, I hope you understand that the Japanese government does not, or Japanese citizens do not use cherry blossoms as a propaganda means. Besides, cherry blossoms do not grow. Trees do not grow in every country. It has to match a certain condition. I think Washington, D.C. offers the ideal, venue for cherry blossoms for 100 years. And we have no intention to spread this to other parts of the world. They appreciate here, and the people who won't appreciate the cherry blossom, they can come to Japan, or they can come to Washington, D.C. Okay.
Ma'am, did you have a question? Could we come down in front?
Thank you. Thanks for your presentation. My name is Li Yang. I would like to focus on the fairness of the trade. And that means fairness for the business, and especially for the small business, and then good for the consumers or general public. At other time, even the world trade or the PPP, they are really benefit a big corporation, and the trade agreement is thousands of pages. I don't think anybody can read it. Probably they have to hire lobbyists or lawyers. And after this trade, you might have found maybe some need, some aid, but then you find out that the cash in barrel and get lost. And also you're thinking about China, they have slogan anti-corruption. I think India Modi has an anti-corruption message. And in the United States, you say in the swamp. I think China has some progress, but I don't think United States made any progress. So I just wonder, with all this trade, you want to benefit the consumer rather than corporation, they just keep the prices higher and higher. So it's really no benefit. And if you think about GDP or employment, if you go this type of things, they are higher, but there's not really benefit the well-being of the general public. And then the world is getting smaller. We have to get along well. We have to benefit the general public. So can you address those issues?
Thank you. If I could maybe distill your thoughts as the only representative of TPP here, are you sticking it to the little guy?
As far as Japan is concerned, Japanese are trying very hard, and we have been successful in elevating the level of living standard in many developing countries, in Asia and in Africa as well. We have used very effectively the means of the so-called ODA assistance. And the rate for borrowing money from the Japanese organization is very low. And this is may not be a surprise to you, but I think our assistance has been appreciated by the general public of the recipient countries, for sure. So we have no worries whatsoever about what you're saying.
Thank you very much. I think we probably have time for one more question. Yes. 2 more questions. Please make them quick. Yes, sir.
Satohiro Akimoto. I have a question to Raja and Ambassador Saiki. Raja mentioned that the U.S. policy is not clear, and Ambassador Saiki said that the leadership is lacking in Washington and Europe. Do you think this is particular to this administration, or do you think this is a sort of long-term trend in the United States that started in Obama administration as a reaction to very aggressive Bush administration policy? We have overextended. There are lots of serious issues that we can't solve it. Well, so my question is, as I said, whether you think this lack of leadership or lack of focus in policy is particular to this administration, or do you think it's some sort of midterm, long-term trend in the United States? Because I think it's an important issue because it's related to a trust issue.
Raja.
Thank you.
I think it's a long-term trend. I mean, I think you can go back to see even after the Second World War. I mean, I think there was a lot of hesitation in the U.S. to join up on alliances. The U.S. had to be dragged into the First World War, into the Second World War. So there is a deep sense of, look, I mean, that the commitments you're making, are they worth it? And I think as the costs of those commitments have gone dramatically, as you said, under the Bush administration, the 2 great Asian wars, 2 great wars in the Middle East, and I think that problem, and as the U.S. economy, weakens under its domestic political volatility, you see those questions far more sharply today. But I think what President Trump said 2 days ago on Syria, I mean, not just with what President Obama was saying earlier. So I think you have a secular trend, I think, that more and more people will challenge the consensus of we all assume exists in Washington for a certain type of policies. And after '89, I mean, I think you had a sense of American, dominance over the system, unipolar world. But today, as challenges mount, for example, certainly from China's rise, I think eventually the US will have to decide to do fewer things. It's not going to throw its energy everywhere. And that if it is going to concentrate on a few things, then I think it'll have to decide a set of hierarchy of priorities, and then what is the thing that you're going to do. And all this, I think, will certainly take us back. The Japan, India, and other Asian countries will have to pick up the slack in a significant way.
And finally, sir.
Hi, my name is Hunter. I'm one of the American University Foreign Policy Seminar students. And earlier you guys mentioned that getting the private sector involved is going to be a crucial part in infrastructure development programs. What kind of incentives are India and Japan and the US planning to create? And also, how do you ensure that the infrastructure projects aren't just a bunch of resorts?
Sumona?
As far as incentives, I mean, yes, I do think that the private sector will be critical in this strategy for infrastructure development across Asia Pacific. As far as the incentives, I think that is the subject of a lot of discussion in the 3 governments of US, India, and Japan currently. I don't know exactly how they will come into play, but I suspect it will involve looking at existing resources in terms of working with the multilateral development banks and other national institutions that are designed to promote private sector activity. And insofar as the governments have a hand in deciding what infrastructure projects are worthwhile, I don't think there will be a lot of support for resorts. I do think you'll see things like port connectivity, roads, a lot of the traditional infrastructure categories, but again, some of the newer categories, as I mentioned, soft connectivity, electronic connectivity, power, grids, things like that, that really ultimately will help people.
Thank you very much.
Let me add one thing to what Justice she said. Conventional infrastructure building is something that we're all involved in many countries, and we're helping the developing countries build the roads and build bridges and railways. But in addition, what we're doing in Japan is to develop the human resources of the developing countries. We can build the railway, speedway, okay, or the high-speed railway in India. But who is going to run the trains? We need to develop human resources who can run the trains actually. And we're inviting more than 1,000 young train operators to Japan so that they can go through the program in Japan in railway companies. And then they go back after 2 or 3 years of training period in Japan. They go back and independently they can run their own speed, the high-speed trains. So this is part of the assistance in addition to the so-called hardware or software infrastructure.
Thank you very much for your excellent questions, and please thank the panelists.
On behalf of Sasakawa USA, I want to thank you all for coming. You've been a great audience. Before you all leave, I did want to mention two things. One, May 2nd, we have our annual Sasakawa Security Forum. It's a whole day discussion about U.S.-Japan security issues ranging from North Korea to nuclear policy to how we strengthen our alliance. So I hope you'll sign up. It'll be at the Willard Hotel. And the second thing I want to mention is events like this that are very complex don't just happen. There's a lot of hard work over many months that goes into that. And Kazuyo Kato and Joy Shampalu and Brittany Washington have been working very hard. And then today we had 3 of our interns, Ann, Chris, and Yosuke, helping. Could we give them a round of applause as well for their great efforts? And thank you all very much for your attention and for participating in today's event. Thank you.